All right, let's talk instrumentation. So we're going to have a semester dedicated instrumentation. I want to give you my perspective of why this is important to do and important for us to focus 15 weeks on just talk about instruments. So let's see. Let me share the screen and I'll hit presentation mode. Okay, students that I work with, a real key value is to have strong instrumentation techniques. Sorry, my computer's running slow here. Okay. Boy, hopefully you're seeing it. My computer's still doing funny things here. Okay, here it is. All right, instrumentation. So this class ends up being really important to focus on instrumentation. And the whole idea of understanding instrumentation is to support the research work that you folks are doing and others are doing. So why research? Investigate thoroughly, word background, careful or diligent search, studious inquiry or examination, the collecting of information about a particular subject. So all different perspectives of why research. Now, in your program, we really focus on taking a very systematic approach to research and really relying on the scientific method. I'll have that slide in just a second here. But the systematic approach to understanding something, in this case, some aspect of human movement, we take the scientific approach, scientific method approach. It has to be logical. The procedures need to make sense. The conclusions need to make sense, and they need to be based upon empirical data. Empirical simply meaning that data are collected, and you try to collect them in a very controlled manner so that they have a context. They are reductive and in a way that you can establish general relationships based upon the data collected, based upon the constraints imposed when you collected the data. And really importantly is the research that we do is repeatable. Someone else can do it, and we can describe that process so that someone else can actually reproduce the data that we actually collect. So this is all about scientific method. And I've got this little image here that many of you, if you've taken a class with me, have seen before, where I go through trying to convince us that we're all interested in performance. And performance is simply a bunch of movements put together. Movements is defined as a displacement time period. Movements are caused by forces. Internally, they're generated, forces are generated by muscles. Internally, the muscles are controlled by the nervous system, and ultimately everything's influenced by the environment. Environment being anything external to the person, as well as thoughts that people have. So we talk about psychological influence. Causes the central nervous system to send the wrong signals to the muscles, to generate the wrong force or wrong force at the wrong time or in the wrong direction. It's going to lead to an erroneous displacement in time. It's going to lead to the wrong movement, and that's an error in performance or less effective performance. And we need all these different areas to understand human performance. What we're going to do is focus in on instrumentation. And that's really the measurement aspect. Now, most of my instrumentation is focused on the biomechanics because that's a very technical area. However, there's other instrumentations in motor learning and exercise physiology that's important to touch on as well. And we may get into some of that as we go through. So the scientific method you should be familiar with. It consists of steps of observation where you ask a question. Consists of making a hypothesis, a statement you believe to be true based upon what you know. It consists of conducting an experiment, an analysis, and then ultimately making a conclusion. And the whole idea is to generate empirical information as opposed to relying on anecdotes or stories. All right, so this is what we're striving for, is striving for empirical information. So the other way I like to think about this is the type of work that I do is really applied work, and most of the work done in our department by faculty and students is applied research. And the way I approach it is I like to find things that are interesting to me, or in your case, find things that are interesting to you. And when you do that, you start to ask questions. How do I run faster? How do I bike faster? How do I go further? Whatever it may be. Uh, and when you ask a question, you do try to put down what your thoughts are. What do you think the answer is? All right. And you give an answer based upon what you know. And then ultimately you measure something, measure performance, measure aspects of performance, and then you check and see if you were right. And if you were right, great. If you weren't right, that's okay too, because that's learning. And then ultimately you ask more questions and you repeat this process. It's cyclical. So you ask more questions. What do you think? You measure again. Were you right? Yes, no. Either case, you still ask more questions. So you keep going around and around and around. And then ultimately, when you do that, you find answers that are useful to you, to the community, or what have you. This thing is on auto advance. I don't know why. What we're going to do, oh, wow, what's going on? We are going to focus in on the measurement aspect of this model. And this model is simply another way of looking at the scientific method. But we want to focus in on the measure aspect. And so now I've broken out measure into several different steps, or several different parts. So when we start looking at measuring something about human performance, one, we need to really spend some time on the experimental design. And I just reduced that to what will subjects be asked. It also consists of who we're going to ask to participate in a study. What do our subjects look like? What are the demographics? What is their experience with whatever it is that we're doing? What is their fitness level, what have you? There's all different parameters that are going to help us set up our experiment so that the information we get from that experiment is useful to trying to answer whatever question we're trying to answer. And in designing an experiment, one aspect is what instruments would we use, and to answer that question, we need to know what's going to be measured. When is it going to be measured? How long will the measurements last for? How frequently will measurements be taken? All these types of things, and we're going to touch on that. How to use the instruments, how to use them correctly, how to record data, how to export data, things like that. Once we have the data, then that moves us into an analysis mode or analysis mindset, and we do data processing, or I like to call this data reduction. I call it data reduction because we collect a lot of data, especially in biomechanics. We'll collect data at 1,000 data points per second, and we may do that for 5 seconds. That's 5,000 data points. Well, you need to reduce that data set down to a dependent variable, average, peak, minimum, rates, whatever it is. But you need to reduce the large number of data points you have to something that you're going to ultimately put into a stat analysis program. So we call that data reduction. This is where we start using Excel, we start using MATLAB, things like that. Once we have entered this process, then we are also critically evaluating the data. This is so important. You really need to vet the data. You need to make sure that the data you're getting is correct. So in working in MATLAB, I often get people to plot data and make sure that we're looking at the correct data, that the data follow a certain pattern that we're expecting. We want to compare our data to published data, what's out there. And we want to also be considering alternative approaches to analyzing our data. But we really want to fully vet the data to yield the dependent variables, right? Whatever measurements that we're mostly interested in. And you see I have arrows sort of looping through here. This is an iterative process. And it's really important to go through this process. So when you get to the next step, which is below that final red line, and when you get to your stat analysis, you already have confidence in your data set that when you run your stat analysis, you can trust that stat analysis. A problem I see a lot of people make, or mistake a lot of people do make, is to run an analysis, get the dependent variable, and quickly jump to the stat analysis. They run the stat analysis and they say, "Oh, this parameter is influenced by this, or it's not influenced by that." And then when we go back and look at the raw data, we start finding mistakes in the analysis and the oversights. Right? Maybe something wasn't zero offset. Maybe there was an average calculated over the wrong time period. And now we have to do the stat analysis again, and maybe the stat analysis changes. And this gets into a real dangerous zone where you're chasing your tail in terms of what's happening with the stat analysis. When you run your stat analysis, you should really run it one time with one data set. And you don't want to have to go back and redo your stat analysis with a new data set, because now you may have competing outcomes, and now you've got to explain that away. And you say, well, maybe I messed up in my data reduction steps. Well, we never should have gone and done our stat analysis until we have fully vetted the data. This consists of looking at the data from many different perspectives, making sure that we have an expectation of what the data should look like. Not the exact data, because why would we measure if we already knew the outcome? But we really need to have an understanding of the data processing. And this is a good point to share with others, and question the data even before you run your stat analysis. You don't want to run your stat analysis until you really feel confident that you have your dependent variables. And we'll talk about them in this session. But when we do the instrumentation class, we're really going to focus in on the instrumentation aspect. What are the instruments? How to use them? What are the different settings? What does it mean if you change your sample rate? How do you measure? How long do you measure? Things like that. We will also get into the analysis part. I just changed the color there a little bit because it will just change the emphasis of where we're at. So once we have a data set, how do we start analyzing it? How do we create plots? When do we use Excel? When do we write code to process? How do we use MATLAB? That's so important to be able to do. And that is wrapped into instrumentation, because we really need to critically evaluate our data before we do our stat analysis. So we repeat this process over and over again. And then we finally say, okay, we're confident that these data are ready to be analyzed. Then we run our stat analysis. Okay. And if we do that process well, then we will avoid unscientific methods of problem solving, tenacity, intuition, authority, or rationalistic. We don't want to fall into these camps. And this is, if we don't do a good job with our instrumentation, if we don't do a good job with our data reduction, and if we don't critically evaluate our data set, then we will run into these problems that our biases will start to show, or start creating biases, because we run a stat analysis and maybe the stat analysis agrees with what our original thought was. But then we come back and we say, oh, you know what? We analyzed the wrong period of time. And then you get a different stat outcome. How do you resolve that? Now, how do you resolve that? How do you go back and change your mind that your stat analysis originally agreed, but now you've got a new analysis that does not agree? So again, you don't want to run into that problem. So don't run your stats until you have fully vetted the data. Okay, so really important rule, and we'll go through that as we go through this week. So what we're really gearing up to do, though, is apply research to understand, in my case, endurance performance. And we're using the scientific method to come up with applications for, in this case, swim, bike, run. You may be in a different area, which is fine, but nothing changes. All that changes is whatever picture you put over here on the right-hand side of the slide. Okay, so that's sort of an overview of instrumentation. I hope that's helpful to give a sense for what we're going to do this semester. And looking forward to working with you. This is actually a lot of fun to work on instrumentation. Okay, thanks.